How many times a week should we be having sex?
The one thing is, I'm Kate Moyle, I'm a psychosexual and relationship therapist.
What would you say to someone who has low libido and potentially their partner has high libido?
The disproportionate amount of people that are struggling with sex, it's just massive.
What is your opinion on porn? What is your approach with alternative sexual lifestyles? Should people be faking orgasms?
For me, the biggest problem is
we all lead busy lives, and I will be the first person to say that some things like sorting out my finances easily slips to the bottom of my to-do list. That is until I found Revolut, which is a financial super app for all things money. I am a big believer that when saving for the more aspirational things in life, like going on holiday or even buying your first home, becomes so much easier when you get on top of your everyday spending. Why not make the most of intuitive technology that takes all of the hassle out of budgeting for you and also helps you spend and save smarter? You can join the 28 million people worldwide who've downloaded the Revolut app for free. So I think you know what to do. Download Revolut for free and sign up to your account now. Thanks, guys. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
I'm very excited to chat today. I feel like we've actually said for ages that we wanted to get someone on who specializes in your area. I feel like it's one of those things that not a lot of podcasts, or mainly kind of ones that aren't specifically for that, tackle, but it's obviously something that affects, like, I mean, I'd say the majority of people's lives. And so I'm really, really, really excited to dive into all of the kind of like FAQs, the questions we've got from our audience, and generally just find a little bit more out about sex, intimate relationships, and kind of your expertise. First of all, to give people a little bit of context, could you give us some background?
So I am a psychosexual and relationship therapist. I'm also a psychosexologist. And for me, really, the crux of what I do is I offer talking therapy for people who are struggling with anything to do with sex. So it's a specialist branch of psychotherapy. And the reason that we need a specialist branch is that sex might come into the therapy room for loads of people, for loads of conversations in a small kind of general way. But for some people, they're really stuck with specifics of sex, whether it's anxiety, fear, dysfunction, the impact of medication, they've had injuries, cancer, lack of desire, difficulties in relationships, infertility. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And sometimes we need a space to be able to really unpack that stuff. And because sex is still, even in 2023, quite taboo, a lot of people feel like they need to know that they can do that somewhere and that it's okay to kind of put that hand up and like, do you know, I really need to talk about sex. Like, this makes me feel really embarrassed. I'm so uncomfortable. And so psychosexual therapy really is the space to have those really uncomfortable conversations and to know it's okay. I often say the sign above the door says you can talk about sex here. And I've always been fascinated in psychology and what makes people work. So even as early as university, I was looking at research into sexual partners from a kind of evolutionary perspective. And it all just really clicked into place for me, and it kind of snowballed from there. So I trained first as a psychosexual therapist, then as a relationship therapist, and tied those two things in together. And now I host a podcast about sexual wellness, work with lots of brands, and try and take the learning from inside the therapy room to outside the therapy room. And for me, a massive part of that is almost every single person that I work with says, I feel so embarrassed, I feel so ashamed, this stuff isn't normalized, am I broken? And the disproportionate amount of people that are struggling with sex to talking about struggling with sex, it's just massive.
Right.
And that's because we don't have this kind of healthy sexual culture or narrative or conversations.
Yeah, what is people's, the kind of first reaction of people when you tell them you're a sexologist? Like, what's the perception of that?
I think everyone thinks that I'm like the mum from Meet the Fockers.
Right.
Which is, my job is very different to that, but that's basically what everyone says. They're like, oh, like in Meet the Fockers. And I'm like, oh, she's fabulous, but like, I do something very different
Highly
to that.
rate it. A little bit different.
But I think it's intrigue. I think everyone would love to know what happens behind everyone else's bedroom doors. People either really want to talk to me or don't want to talk to me at all. And
running away.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of representative of the general feeling about when sex comes up as a topic. And I think I've been practicing for probably nearly 10 years. And the difference I've seen in that 10 years is massive.
Really?
Yes. But I think that it's that sense of, okay, like, what are we going to talk about then? Or do we have to talk about it? And sex is so personal, but also such a big part of our lives, but then not. So it's in so many advertising campaigns and it's in, you know, on posters, and we see so much stuff that's sexualized, but then we don't have these kind of healthy foundation sex education conversations. So it's very mixed.
Yeah, and we do have so much, I guess, legacy stigma based on the fact that there is still in people's lifetime now, there have been, I mean, literally 20 years ago, like as in, or 10 years ago even, like there's been such a change in the way we see sex and the way we were able to talk about sex, especially as women. And I can imagine that like legacy stigma, if people are being raised, you know, by someone who actually in their childhood could never, ever, ever, ever even go near the subject, I can imagine there's that kind of lasting stigma there.
Definitely. And we are all initially taught about sex from the generation above, and they've all been taught from the generation above. So we're probably always running a bit behind.
Of course.
Because we can only do so much with the information that we have and the social world. So when we think about sexual revolutions, you know, the pill in the 60s was the first enormous one. And really the second one is the internet.
Right.
And those are big, monumentous moments in terms of how we think about sex, how sex has changed, how we can view sex, how we engage with it as a topic, our autonomy over ourselves sexually. And these are all massive, massive changes that happen kind of overnight.
Of course. And what in your kind of practicing work, what would you say are the biggest things that come up time and time again from kind of first-time clients?
The one thing that comes up with everyone, irrespective of whether we are working on anxiety, you know, recurrent miscarriage, stress, desire, couple difficulties, sexual dysfunctions, lack of sexual experience, the one thing is shame.
Right.
Everyone comes in with the feeling of maybe I'm the broken one, you know, am I broken? I must be the problem. It doesn't look like anyone else has these problems. I don't see myself represented anywhere. And for a lot of people, having to reach out to a psychosexual therapist or any therapist a lot of the time can feel terrifying and feels like such a massive step and a massive ask for help.
And do you think there's a kind of misrepresentation of, I mean, a lot of those things in terms of shame and being like, I'm not seeing myself represented and all of those things, I guess, are based on like a misrepresentation of what a, like, quote unquote norm is, and like whether there's a norm. Where do you think that generally comes from?
God, I think it's in everything. I think we live in what we call a heteronormative society, of course, which is that we assume that the standard is man meets woman and off they go into the sunset, and that's what we kind of use as the standardized model. So anything outside of that is then considered to be not normal, right, in terms of when we use that terminology. Within that, we then have a normal model of sex, which is that intercourse is real sex and everything else isn't, right, or doesn't count as much or isn't as important. And so really then when we're talking to anyone about sex, that's what's considered the norm. And we know that that just isn't the case. We see such a massive diversity in sexualities, in sexual practices, preferences, desires, wants. And when you think about it, we accept that in almost every other area of our lives. We don't all like to go to the same restaurants. Like food is a great analogy, because we don't all like the same restaurants. We weren't all brought up or grew up eating the same foods. We have different tastes. Some of us like our food spicy, some of it like it mild. Some of us like different cuisine. Some of us like to eat the same thing every night for a week. Someone else might be like, I like to eat cereal at dinner instead of at breakfast. And we're completely accepting. We don't all go to a restaurant and expect everyone around the table to eat the same thing, to pick the same thing off the menu. And if we do, I think we'd probably think it was weirder than everyone all doing something different.
And do you think, because obviously sex in its very nature is quite hidden, in the way that obviously I might show my working day on social media, but I don't generally show my sex life on social media. And I feel like, you know, there's part of that that's pretty inherent, I mean, for obvious reasons. Do you think then those stigmas can ever properly change when obviously representation of food is shown everywhere, because you're being like, oh, I love mushrooms, or I love a burger, or like whatever it might be, and you're ordering that at a restaurant, you're not seeing like the different kind of people's like sex lives or sex patterns or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Do you think there's an element of that that will always be pretty underrepresented?
No, I'm not suggesting that everyone...
Right, no, of course, I know that's not what you're suggesting.
Their sex lives on social media at all, but...
She loves OnlyFans.
Well, there are platforms that kind of do that. There's one called Make Love Not Porn, which is like real couples having real sex. A woman called Cindy Gallop founded it, and that was a bit of a pushback against the non-representative versions. I've never even heard of that. It's an amazing platform, actually, and that was a deliberate thing to show these more realistic versions of sex for people that wanted to see it and people that wanted to show it. But I think it's about the conversation much more than anything else. And we see it, I work with a luxury sex toy brand called Lilo, and it's been amazing. I love Lilo. I gifted a Lilo to every single one of my close friends at Christmas one year. Oh. The Lilo Sona 2, in case anyone is interested. It's great. An excellent product. Get 5-star reviews. I literally gifted it to everyone. I was like, and one to you, and one to you, and one to you. I was like, you're a good friend. Thank you so much. I like to encourage healthy sex life. But for me, even seeing, and it's something I've noticed a lot recently, that influencers and people are happy to advertise sex toys on their platforms and on their pages, I think is a massive thing, because
100%.
What that's saying is, I love sexual pleasure, I like to experience this myself, and that's another part of my well-being. Like I show, you know, my meals, like I show my workout routine, and you're not having to show yourself self-pleasuring or showing anything, but it's just a part of the conversation which positions it alongside other areas of your health, and it's just saying, it's okay. Yeah. You know? And especially when we've seen there's so little out there on women's pleasure. And I think that, you know, we talk a lot about the fact that in kind of sex education at school or wherever it might be, we are never taught about women's pleasure, and sex is seen as you say, penetrative sex between a man and a woman. It's seen as like, that is what sex is. Whereas obviously we know the stats on like how many women can actually have an orgasm through penetrative sex, or, you know, women who spend, I mean, I put a question sticker up on my story before this, and the amount of women that were answering being like, I've never had an orgasm through sex, like all of this. And based on the fact that I've read up a lot on it, I've kind of been like, I really hope you know that that's like so not, and I hope you're not thinking there's like, you know, something wrong, which obviously is what we'll be going through. We're going to answer like a load of FAQs and everything and get your opinion on them. But it's just, I love the idea that kind of being able to normalize the fact that actually, as you say, it's almost like part of self-care, and just being able to like share experience and increase that representation in terms of being like, the more we're able to talk about things, and as you say, it's not about showing it, it's not about kind of changing that entirely, but it's about just being able to normalize and advocate for, you know, in that circumstance, for example, women's pleasure. It's just about it being there. Right. And being a part of the conversation. And we know, for example, this has a massive impact on the health of women and people with vulvas, that we so often use the word vagina to mean vulva. And when we're talking about vulva, we're talking about the external genitals, and we're talking about the vagina, which is the internal canal. Yes. And so often people colloquially use the word vagina to mean vulva. And that is anatomically incorrect, but it's miseducation. So how can we educate people about vulval cancers, about gynecological cancers, when they can't identify exactly what's going on in which part of their body? And the Eva Peel have done amazing research on this, which has found something like 45% of women couldn't correctly identify all of their anatomy on a diagram. And I'm not sure if that's the exact stat, but it's definitely around that number. And that's an education thing. That's got health risks. But then when we put that into pleasure, the clitoris was not mentioned in sex education. Ever. Like, it's not a... It's like it doesn't exist. Yeah. And so the focus was always on not getting STIs and how to or not get pregnant. And that denies the pleasure. And there's an amazing researcher called Dr. Laurie Mintz, and she talks about how when we use the language incorrectly, so when we say vagina or we mean vulva, we're actually eradicating the part of the female anatomy which creates the most pleasure. Right. So it's not even then a part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And in the way we're kind of talking about representation, as a sex therapist, sexologist, what is your opinion on porn?
Such a big topic, and it's one that obviously brings up a lot of moral conversations with people. I was actually at a talk this week with Erica Lust, who's an amazing feminist pornographer and director. And I think that for me, the biggest problem is that we haven't built in what we call porn literacy, right? Which is, we know it's there, we know it's not going anywhere, we know the internet isn't going anywhere. So how do we build in, when young people particularly can access it, an educative element which closes the gap? Because that's the thing, we have this gap between porn and real sex, and we know that that gap is there. And so by young people, if they're going to the internet to get their education most of the time, which they are, because they don't have to ask anyone, no one's embarrassed, it's an easy way of getting it without having to kind of go through any mortifying conversations with adults who also don't feel comfortable, then that's the first thing you're probably going to come across. It's a huge percentage of the internet. And what we can then do, or what we should be doing, is using our focus to say, okay, if that's what you're going to see, which you're going to probably see without anyone else being able to get there first, how do we say that's porn and real life sex is different and is not represented? This is not representative of everything that actually might happen. Right. And I think that that's the biggest thing that we really need to focus on.
Because you don't also, like, as part of that conversation, when we're saying, you know, even when we talk about educating on women's or female pleasure, when you're, you know, talking about sex education, all of these things, the conversation that always comes back is like, why are we showing, you know, children or early teenagers about sex? We obviously know in the data that the more we're able to normalize something and the more we're able to educate where it's happening anyway, is probably going to be an advantage. But also, you know, I understand that in the conversation when we're saying, oh, you know, we should be showing 13-year-olds what real sex is like, obviously there's going to be pushback on that too. How do we kind of put that in between when people are, I know, obviously people at 13 are searching up porn and they're kind of trying to work out, you know, what sex even is, what it even looks like, what they should be kind of expecting from it, all of that, and obviously getting something that is probably vastly misrepresented. How do we get that in there whilst not exposing people who aren't maybe at that stage yet and are,
I think, really children? Solid sex education, giving younger people, there are some amazing sexual health, sex education charities doing really brilliant work in this sector. But I think it's also giving young people a chance to ask all the questions, and I think that they want the answers, but they don't want to be faced with the awkwardness that can come about by having to ask them sometimes, or the shame. You know, why are you asking that? Why would you want to know that? And there are some brilliant sex educators at the moment and organisations who are helping parents to have those conversations, because again, you know, that thing we were talking about earlier, one generation teaches the next. Parents need help. You know, I'm a parent and I don't know exactly how to perfectly have this conversation with my kids when we get to that point. And I do this for a job. Yeah. And that is a really normal part of our existence. And that's because we want to get it right. And so we then feel frozen and panicky about the idea of getting it wrong.
I remember, that's just the reason I was laughing, because I was thinking about when my mum had clearly found out that I'd had sex with my boyfriend when I was like a teenager. And I just remember we'd just broken up and we were like, me and my mum were like, we weren't home all the time, like, together, and we were like sitting next to each other on the sofa, and I remember she just came and sat down, like, didn't really look at me, and she goes, how are you dealing with the breakup? And I was like, yeah, okay, thanks. And she goes, well, you know, it is really hard sometimes. I was like, yeah, it's really hard. She goes, especially if it was sexual. And then we just sit in silence, and then she kind of walked off, and I just sat there like,
my mum knows.
That was horrible. I just so vividly remember that experience. Obviously had like never spoken about something like that at that point, but I remember, you know, like when I first started having sex and I remember finding out at school about the fact that, you know, contraception was free and you could go to a clinic and like all of that. And to be fair, whatever age I was, like, I remember going to St Mary's Hospital in Paddington,
Mm-hmm.
like finding out about it, going there, sitting there in like my school uniform, literally people looking at me like, what the fuck? And just being like, oh, can I get the pill, please? And I just remember, I mean, there is obviously a lot of, you know, there's some great access within the UK in terms of things like that. I wouldn't say anyone sat there and, you know, kind of had a proper conversation with me, but even the access to something like a contraceptive without having to like have your parents there, etc., I think obviously very important. But I assume the majority of the time, if that's not like presented as an option, then also that's why, you know, people feel too embarrassed to talk about it and therefore too embarrassed to protect themselves properly when they're not ready to maybe talk to someone about it.
Yeah, and again, it's the education thing. It's not knowing, you know, for me, a huge part of my job is helping people to make informed choices about their sexual well-being, informed choices about their sexual health. So how do we work out for them actually what they want, rather than having the sex that they think they should be having because that's what they've been told or what we kind of grow up with. And there's an amazing author, educator called Emily Nagoski, and she wrote an incredible book. And she talks about how sex is a bit like gardening. And so we can't choose like where we were planted, where the garden was planted or where it started, but we can fertilize the soil, we can look after some bits, we can decide which bits we don't want to water, which bits we don't want to grow, and which bits we want to focus on and which we want to nurture. And I think that sex can be like that because so many of us take what we're given about sex and we don't ever question it, and we don't ever think about it, and we don't ever wonder, okay, well, is this working for me? Or is there a reason I'm not really enjoying this? Or is there a reason that I'm feeling really embarrassed or really ashamed? Or this doesn't feel good for me, but I think it's what I should be doing. I think it's what is normal. And therefore I should just carry on doing that, because what if I said to my partner, do you know what, this isn't working for me? And they said, what? Well, that's just what we do. I would be the one that would feel like I'm the problem.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair enough. And how would you encourage people to kind of, I guess you don't know what's not the norm and what is the norm, or if there is any norm or any of that until you know. And so like, how would you encourage people to, I guess, combat that and find out what, as you say, part of the analogy, what parts you like do want to water?
I think it's finding out what your normal is. And I think that can sound quite therapy, you know, like there is no normal, find out what your normal is. But the reality is it's about finding what works for you. All bodies, although like mapped out in a similar way, are unique, are different. We're going to have learned from our experiences and have gone through life with some things working for us and some things not, and have learned what we like or don't like or what we're curious about. And I think that not assuming is a big part of it. But the problem with that is often if we're the partner, it takes the confidence and ability to know how to communicate with our partners, which we're not taught. You know, I often say that trying to have a conversation about sex is like trying to talk in a language that we haven't been taught. Because where do we see the versions of people sitting down and talking about their sex lives? Or where do we only ever see the kind of Hollywood version, which typically are, it's gone really well or it's gone really badly.
Right, sure.
You know, a couple kind of awkwardly lying in bed, like with the sheets up to hip, being like, oh, so, how do you think that went? You know, that's like the you know, the kind of version that we see. And sometimes it's about being able to feel confident enough to say to our partners, like, can we talk about sex? Or can we talk about our sex life? Or can we talk about what's working or not working? Or I'm really curious about this. How would you feel about trying it? And then if our partner says no, say, okay, that's, you know, understandable. What is it that you don't like the sound of? Or what do you think we could try? And these are kind of conversations we have in so many other areas of our lives, but we don't really know how to when it comes to sex.
Yeah, no, that's so fair enough. And I just want to briefly touch again on that conversation about porn. What are the biggest kind of misconceptions or issues you see coming into your workplace as a therapist based on porn or based on people's experience with porn?
I don't think it's just porn. I think it's everything. Yeah. It's that sex has to look a certain way, that our bodies have to look a certain way, that you know, particularly men have to have erections that perform in a certain way, that last a certain amount of time, that both partners have to simultaneously orgasm, that certain acts are for everybody, that we have to do certain things, that we have to be kind of orgasming in every position and simultaneously and perfectly in sync with our partners, that nothing ever goes wrong, that people don't ever get cramp or their bodies make weird noises or a position doesn't work or they laugh. You know, we never see the everyday
of course,
and the kind of fumbling and the messiness of sex. We don't see contraception in lots of those scenes or films. And I'm not just talking about porn, I'm talking about sex on screen. And I think this is, again, where intimacy coordinators have started to play a really good role in our TV scripts. So things like Normal People, Sex Education. There are intimacy coordinators on set who not only are protecting the actors, but they're helping to navigate some of those scenes to make them look more realistic, to make sure that, you know, the angles of bodies look like they're actually having sex. Because sometimes, and historically, we've seen bodies in positions that we all think, oh, I don't think I'd be able to do that at home. Like, how did they make that work? And it's because they're not realistic. And actually, you know, when you have someone on set who's also a movement coordinator, they're saying, okay, guys, this angle doesn't work. Because then you get people at home trying to reenact it and everyone's going, what's wrong with me? They could do it. I can't do it. And those thoughts, when it comes to sex, really burrow into,
of course,
you know, our self-confidence, our self-esteem. If we are struggling with sex in a relationship and that relationship ends, we kind of carry the hangover of the sexual struggles with us to the next relationship. Or if we're dating, or if it hasn't gone well and, you know, maybe perhaps we've had a partner who might have blamed us for that, or we're feeling like we're the problem, then we don't check it out with people like we do other areas of our health, well-being, mental health. You know, if something wasn't working for you in another area of your life, you'd probably sit down with a good mate or a sibling or someone you trust and be like, can I ask you, like, what's going on with that? And we don't do it with sex.
Yeah, to be fair, I think that's one of the things I'm also like most grateful for with my friends, in terms of like, it does, I mean, not all of them at all, but I will say there are like certain, and I feel very lucky to have like certain groups where we're kind of like, I just remember, I mean, I won't say what he said, but like I was sitting down with like a few friends the other day, and we were kind of like having dinner, and one of them was just came out with something obviously like about his sex life, and he was like, oh, I never, you know, like whatever, and it was like just like fully in depth, and then we just had this conversation over dinner, and I was like, I feel so lucky to be like able to have that conversation, and it's not grimy, it's not like it doesn't feel like intrusive, it feels like people trying to work themselves out, like, who, you know, we're not taught that from external sources, and just being able to talk about that type of thing I think is so valuable. And I'm completely, you know, aware of the fact that that's not always normal in every friend group or in every situation, but I do think kind of having that open conversation is so important for being able to like normalize.
And that not every conversation about sex is sexualized.
Of course.
And I think that's one of the fears that lots of people have always had is how do I talk about this with it not being a sexualized conversation?
Of course.
And you know, that's exactly what psychosexual therapy is. You know, I'd say a lot of it is pretty unsexy,
right,
and
of course,
you know, a lot really uncomfortable. And you know, we're really kind of helping people to talk about the things that they feel most, you know, challenged by. And that's such a big thing, you know, because you go in so fearful, like, what is going to happen if I kind of open up a Pandora's box of this? And actually, so much of the time, it's because we have paired up sex with anxiety or something negative or something stressful, and then we see the knock-on effect on our sex lives, on our intimacy. We don't want to date because we're scared about getting close to someone and then sex not working, and then we would feel like a failure. And you know, all these words like failure, broken, I hear them all the time. And then so someone might say not kind of let their friends like ever set them up with anyone, or go on a dating app, or because they don't want to risk meeting someone, liking them and trying to have sex, so they would rather just avoid the whole thing. But then it's difficult because all of their friends are starting to date or to settle down, and that's what they want, but they're you know, most scared of the thing that they want the most. And that's a really generalized example, but it's a common one.
No, absolutely. So I asked my audience what questions they'd like answered to be able to find out more about sex, to be able to find out the norms around sex, to be able to have better sex. We're going to go through them, if that's okay, and tackle the big questions.
This is like sex therapy live.
I know, exactly. I'm going to start with a few on essentially individual. I want to speak about some within kind of a couple setting as well, because got lots of questions on kind of both sides. So first of all, what seems to be a very commonly asked question is, libido-wise, how many times a week should we want to have sex, or should we be having sex?
I knew this was going to be the first question.
I guess too.
Everyone always wants to know what is a normal amount of sex, and there just isn't a clear answer. And that's because we know that sex is in the context of the rest of our lives, so it's impacted by. It's not a constant.
Of course,
it's not like, once, twice a week we have sex. That's it, done. And really, again, it goes back to that answer that people find really frustrating, because it's not a straight answer, which is the right amount for you. And the biggest problem that we see in couples isn't kind of the regularity or the amount of sex, it's where we see a desire discrepancy, which is the difference between what, if there's two people in that relationship, those two people want. And actually the amount of sex we're having, or the regularity of sex we're having, it's a red herring for quality of sex. We can't kind of say exactly that, having sex 3 times a week means that you're having better quality sex than someone who's having sex once a month, because the sex that they might be having might be completely satisfactory and enjoyable for them, and that's all that they need. Yeah. And so for me, I'm much more interested in the satisfaction and the quality of the sex that people are having than how much. But when it becomes a problem, or if you feel like it's a problem, that's the time to kind of talk to a partner and to say, okay, do you know what's not working here? Because as soon as it becomes something that, what lots of couples do is, if something they become stuck on, it all becomes the center of every argument.
Of course, yeah.
And then you see it having a knock-on effect into other areas of the relationship.
And what would you suggest at someone who's at that stage where they're kind of finding that sex becomes the topic of every argument, and it comes back to that, and there seems to be a lot of frustration around it?
Yeah, I think there can be a lot of frustration. I would try and just get to the bottom of what's going on. So what often happens is, for one partner, sex might be, and physical intimacy might be, like a real indicator of love in a relationship. That's how they feel valued. That's how they feel desired. For them, it is a really important kind of core part. For other people, it's less of a priority. And then if you understand that from each other, you can understand that, okay, so why maybe I'm the one that needs to kind of just think about that a bit more, or the other partner can say, do you know what, I understand that you might see this differently to me, so how can we make a bit more space and time to work on this? And this is how we understand that desire works. Desire isn't always spontaneous. If feel turned on and excited out of nowhere, like a kind of bolt of lightning, and then we have sex. For a lot of people, it's responsive, which means that it emerges in response to starting something physical or some kind of sexual stimulation. So that can explain why lots of people say, I wasn't really feeling in the mood for sex. I was thinking, actually, I'd rather just go to sleep. But then we were kissing and we were touching, and I started to feel excited. And then we started moving into sex.
So some people are more likely to be generally turned on or have a high kind of libido throughout their, day, week, or whatever. And some people will only have that libido activated if it's activated by something like touch or some sort of stimulation.
Yeah, and we see that people can have both types of desire. But we see that particularly in long-term relationships, because we're used to each other.
Of course,
it's not that we're not as explorative, we're not kind of getting to know each other in the same way, and that we often see that responsive desire becomes a more dominant way of experiencing desire. But then we can really take control of our sex lives when we know that. But most of us think that when we think that spontaneous desire is the only type of desire. So then as soon as we stop having that, we think, I've lost all desire. So I've got no desire anymore. Actually, responsive desire tends to be alive and well. It's just not the version that we've been taught and that we've seen.
And do you think then that a couple can have like a healthier sex life by maybe signposting, maybe a night a week they have sex, or like a occasion that they have sex, or like something that, you know, that kind of like sleep hygiene thing that's like your body knows if you're about to go to sleep if you like turn on this music and turn down the lights, or like whatever it might be. Would you advocate for that when it comes to sex?
I think absolutely making the space for kind of physical and intimate time. As psychosexual therapists, we don't prescribe that people kind of schedule sex,
right? Sure.
Because it can create pressure. And then, especially bear in mind, you know, a lot of the time we're working with people who are struggling with sex.
Yeah, of course.
So kind of saying, right, on Tuesday night you're going to go home and have sex, just fills them with anxiety and fear, and that's not helpful. But creating a dedicated space where I often say to couples, put your phones away, you know, screen-free evening or screen-free time, just to focus on each other, whether it's talking, eye contact, touching, all the things that are basic parts of human communication that start to release the kind of neurochemicals that make us feel close to each other, that start to make you feel like you've got someone's undivided attention, all the things that play a big part in sex, and then using that to kiss, touch, talk, be together, just be close. That is a platform from which we can start to see responsive desire emerging.
That's so interesting. And do you think it's possible for a couple with two different sex drives or very different sex drives to be compatible long term?
I would say it's more normal and expected for partners to have different levels of sexual desire, interest, libido, than for them to be perfectly matched.
And just working around that in terms of communication and...
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly in long-term relationships, we have to nurture that part of our relationship, of our sex life. And again, we think it's not sexy to have to work at this stuff. We think it's not sexy to have to talk about it. We think that it should just happen, that relation, and that's just not the case. It's something that we need to kind of consciously and intentionally do sometimes, but we don't like that version.
It's like anything in life, like when you get used to something or you get into a routine, like it's easy to expect that if it's meant to happen, then it's just going to happen. But we don't actually expect that for anything else in our life. Nothing. Like literally for like going to the gym, for like going to see our friends if we have to make space in our schedule, like any of those different types of things. We don't expect it to just fall into place. Otherwise it's quote unquote like not meant to be, or like not healthy or whatever.
God, yeah.
We have to signpost time for it. And we have to, you know, prioritize or deprioritize or whatever it might be. And we very much do have this expectation, almost like this kind of animalistic expectation that we'll just like have sex when we want to have sex. And if we're not, then we're, you know, maybe not into each other anymore or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And that our relationships just work.
Right, sure.
And I think it's all tangled up in the same thing. But I say this all the time. Our friendships, we check in with our friends, we book dinner, we, you know, book weekends away, or we, you know, with our kids, we sit down with them, we do stuff, we do our homework, we teach them to do their homework, we teach them to learn, we check in with our families, we call our mum, you know, with our colleagues, we work at it, we're putting stuff in. You know, you've not built your business from not putting things in and then you get things out. And so, but we think that our relationships and sex lives are these magical unicorns that just look after themselves.
Right.
And that doesn't really make any sense.
Not gonna happen.
No. But the amount of times that people say to me, I just thought this would work itself out. And it doesn't. And I always say, but nothing just works itself out.
And what causes low libido?
Oh, everything. You know, we live in. What doesn't? You know, of course, there are physical factors. So some people might be having, you know, difficulties with hormone levels, or difficulties with their relationship with their bodies, painful sex. So anything basically that can negatively impact sex can have a negative impact on desire, because desire, our motivation for sex, our want to be sexual, is not going to be thriving if sex itself is causing us pain, discomfort, emotional distress. So why would we want something that isn't working for us? And so when it's not working, we aren't, you know, motivated or driven to do it, but we don't necessarily always know how to kind of put our hand up and say, do you know what, this isn't, how do I change this? And
I don't know how to word this properly, but is low libido kind of a quote unquote issue? I don't mean that in the way of like, obviously it will be you know, a problem for some people's relationships or whatever it might be. But when we kind of saying there's no norm, I guess if someone thinks they have a low libido and they need, is it something that they need to fix?
It depends if they feel like they need to fix it.
Right.
So we need to differentiate between arousal and desire. So desire is the motivation and the want for sexual experiences.
Okay.
Arousal is the body's physical and psychological processes of preparing the body for sex. So if someone, and when those two things are aligned, we call it concordance. So, and then when they're not, we talk about arousal or sexual non-concordance, which is basically when mind and body are out of sync, which can explain why people have experiences like, I'm feeling like physically turned on in a physio appointment or something like that. I'm not attracted to my physio,
Right.
but it's just my brain has responded to something which is sexually relevant, which is that I'm being touched.
Right.
And it's doing its thing. It's preparing the body for something. And people are horrified when they have these experiences because they go, oh my God, I feel so mortified. This is not, you know, what if they notice something? And that's because your brain is responding to what's sexually relevant in your environment.
Right.
And then what's personal to you are those things that you find exciting and a turn on and desiring. And those things are about the person rather than the kind of mechanisms at play.
Yeah.
And so what we want is for people to be having kind of body and mind in sync. So psychologically, I'm interested in sex with my partner, and then my body helps me along. But we see like vaginal dryness, for example, is a really common symptom for women who are perimenopausal or going through menopause or breastfeeding, might have kind of hormonal changes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that can then make sex uncomfortable.
Right.
Which can mean that, or we can start to feel, you know, embarrassed. Or like,
Yeah.
oh God, why is this happening to me?
Yeah.
Like, this is not what I've been shown. And then we can start to kind of shy away from sex, or we feel a responsive lack of desire because it's not giving us the benefits.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What would you say to someone who was like listening to this and has low libido and potentially their partner has high libido and it's obviously causing some issues, but they can't see, like, even with communication, they can't seem to get past it. What would you say? Because obviously no one wants to and should be having sex if they don't want to be having sex. Also, I can imagine the pressure of like the relationship and trying to fix it or whatever it might be. What would you say to someone in that type of situation?
I'd say try and work out what works better for you both. So is it that actually you're someone who notices that when you start kissing or that you are feeling like your partner's hands on yourself and that, like on you, and that feels really good, or that you have to kind of switch off from your day and switch on to a sexual mindset? You know, I think a lot of people find it very difficult to be sexually interested when they're still really preoccupied with their day, or they haven't switched off from work, or, you know, they're getting into bed and they're checking their emails and they can see that they've got 5 emails from their boss and then they're distracted by that. So work out the ways to help you kind of what I call switch off to turn on, to kind of get in the right space or headspace. And also sex education across the lifetime. Like, I recommend podcasts, TED Talks, books. There's so much good normalizing, non-stigmatizing, non-shaming content out there at the moment by experts and researchers. And I think when we understand more what's going on for us, how our body works, how our brain works, how sex works, suddenly we think, okay, well, I can do something about this. Or because the minute we feel bad about ourselves, that's not going to be a turn on. That's not going to make us feel open to sex. It does the opposite.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What is your approach with clients who have alternative sexual lifestyles? Like something that we wouldn't consider normal in terms of their sexual desires? So
the way that people most commonly talk about this is they talk about phrases, kink and vanilla is a phrase that people often use. So vanilla would refer to what we consider to be that kind of general type of sex, basically non-kinky sex. But this whole thing is so subjective. You know, what's your vanilla is not necessarily my vanilla. And I think also what we've seen is the term vanilla has been used in quite a detrimental way. Yeah. And a colleague of mine always says, vanilla's delicious. You know, it's creamy. I love it. It's my favorite flavor. And, you know, for me, it really works.
Yeah.
If that's the type of sex that people like to have, like, there's no shame in that. It goes back to the individual differences thing. And again, probably where it becomes a problem is where we see that partners might have different interests.
Right, sure.
And that's about how you manage that in your relationship. And if you're, for example, really curious about trying something kinky with your partner, or you're really interested in trying something, you might say to your partner, if you kind of feel able to, I'm really interested in this, what do you think? Or you could send them a podcast or something. I often say to people, if you find an article about something, send it to your partner and say, what do you think about this? And use that as a conversation starter. And your partner might say, oh, do you know what? Not for me, actually. But then work out what could be an in-between that you both feel comfortable with, that you could try. Because obviously if we're nervous about something, sometimes we might think, well, do you know what? I'd rather not. Like that might be a bit too much for me. But there are so many ways that you can navigate that, or things that you can try that can introduce those elements of excitement or novelty or something new or something that you're curious about.
I want to talk about marriage. So lots of people asked about kind of longer term relationships and marriage. Do you see marriage changing sex lives? And if so, why do you think it kind of changes?
I don't think marriage in itself changes sex lives, but commitment, I think, can change sex lives, whatever that looks like for that couple, or if there's more than two partners in a relationship. But I think that it's all about what we talk about in therapy is the invisible contract. So what's the contract that you guys have made? Is it that it's one of monogamy? Is it that that's something that's explicit? Is it that that's something that's assumed? So whenever I'm working with couples, we really get down to the nitty gritty of, you know, what have you explicitly agreed to do in your relationship? What is this model of your relationship going to look like? Because sometimes people might just think, oh yeah, well, you know, we just were on the same path and it just kind of happened. And then we, you know, I thought we were agreed on that, didn't we? And it might have never been a conversation. So I think it's about the rules that you set and the boundaries that you set for your relationships. Now, what we do see is that in long-term relationships, typically sex happens more at the start of relationships, or sex might be more adventurous at the start of relationships. We kind of see a decline gradually, and that's a common trend. But then what we need to do is to focus on the quality then of that sex. And I think that that's where actually people that have been in long-term relationships can report a really good quality of sex, because they know each other well. They might feel more confident with someone that they're really close to and more able to relax, particularly people with things like body confidence difficulties, because they're with someone who shows them that they love them and appreciate them and desires them and are attracted to them. And so they can feel more comfortable with someone that they feel familiar with.
Yeah. And how would you recommend someone with body confidence issues that's kind of affecting their sex life approaches sex? I
think it massively impacts sex. You know, I work with so many people who don't feel comfortable in their body for just so many reasons, whether it's specifically about their genitals and the sexual parts of their body, or just about feeling comfortable in their own skin. Yeah. Because if we are struggling with how we feel that we look, or how we feel like our body appears, or how we feel in our bodies, then we have to be quite exposed and vulnerable to be sexual with someone, because we're putting that part that we don't feel comfortable with in front of someone else for someone else to see. And obviously we know that a lot of those things are our own stuff and our own internal critics, and quite a lot of the time learned experiences or things people have said to us, and our partners don't necessarily see that. But it can be sometimes for people might need to manage their environments a bit more. So to wear something that makes them feel good, or to change the lighting, or to focus on sensory input. And this is where things like mindful sex can actually play quite a big role as well, because when we're struggling with our body and how we feel about it, we're so in our head, preoccupied with our thoughts. And actually that takes away from our pleasure. Yeah. Because where we direct our attention, we experience more. And that's why it's not uncommon, for example, to see people who are struggling with body confidence and sex say that they're also struggling with orgasm, because it takes their attention away from what they're physically feeling and the pleasure, which is most likely to drive them to peak pleasure and to orgasm, because they're up in their heads, preoccupied with what they think is going on, by their thoughts, by their focus on what their partner might be thinking. And your attention's kind of off in different directions.
And what is mindful sex?
So mindful sex is basically incorporating mindfulness techniques, so things like helping you to be in the present, to channel your attention in a particular intentional direction and bringing that into sex. So things like focusing on the senses, trying to kind of be in the moment, not distracted by your thoughts, not focusing on a goal. Or so particularly with orgasm, we see it's really common to become really preoccupied with the goal orientated nature of sex, which is, if I'm struggling with orgasm, I become so focused on having one that I then can't get to it. It's kind of like an ironic, an ironic process. And so then what we need to do is kind of get into the physical by things like focusing on the 5 senses. So really bringing our attention into the here and now in order to experience more physically.
Yeah, and so if someone was struggling with reaching an orgasm and kind of having that as a persistent issue, what would you recommend as your kind of top few things to be practicing?
So I think one of those would be focusing on the senses. So things like, okay, I can feel my partner's hand like running up my arm. I can feel like the warmth from their skin. I can smell them. I can see them. I'm running my hand through their hair. So you're kind of running through, because you can't be out of the moment and experiencing those things in the right here and now. I think the other thing might be kind of unpacking what it is that's stopping you. You know, a lot of people, it's shame around pleasure, fear of being out of control, worries about kind of narratives that they might have been taught about what it means to be someone that experiences this type of pleasure or enjoys sex. There's so many kind of undertones and stories about sex or what it is to be someone that likes sex. Or, you know, I think we all know those stories from when we were younger, you know, about people used to say things like, oh, girls that dress like that, or people that act like that. And there is so much loaded in that. And particularly when we're learning about sex, we can internalize all those ways that we think we're meant to be. And if we feel that we're different, that can cause a real inner conflict.
Yeah, no, I can completely understand that. And what would you say the biggest misconceptions are around orgasms?
Oh, that simultaneous couple orgasm is like the holy grail.
Right.
Because that's, I think, what everyone thinks they should be aiming towards all the time. But as we know, the orgasm gap exists in heterosexual relationships. So the difference between men and women's reported rates of orgasm in different sexual experiences.
Right.
And so there's just no problem with partners orgasming at different times in different ways through different methods. But I think we all got so preoccupied with that version.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
And also that it's always the goal.
Yeah.
You know, that great sex can happen without orgasm.
Yeah.
You can really enjoy yourself without it ending in an orgasm. And I think that that's another big thing for us to think about.
And for people who don't know, could you talk a little bit about the orgasm gap?
So this is a piece of research, again, Laurie Mintz, I mentioned earlier, basically found that there is a significant gap. It's around 30% between how often men and women in different sex, so male and female sexual experiences, were orgasming and then were reporting orgasming. And then it was how much men were reporting their female partners orgasming. And that gap was, again, massively reduced because what it showed is that a lot of women were faking their orgasms. And so then when you think about why they're doing that, a lot of the time it was because I don't want to upset my partner, because I don't want them to think that I'm not good at this, because I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing, because sex ends when we orgasm. Right. And so we're kind of at the point now where I feel like we're trying so long, so I'll just fake it to bring it to a close. And a lot of them are social reasons.
And should people be faking orgasms?
No. It's a short-term solution for something which doesn't help long-term. Because what it also does is it means that a lot of people feel like, and men fake orgasms too. Yeah. But what happens is you then tend to get into a rhythm of repeating the thing which doesn't get you to orgasm, and your partner thinks they're doing it right. You know they're not doing it right. And when I say right, I mean right for you. They you're thinking, oh, this isn't going to work for me, but I can't tell them because I've started this now and we've been doing it like this for 6 months. And now if I say, then they'll know that I've been faking it for 6 months and that's going to rupture our relationship. And this is the person I love. I don't want to hurt them. So just try and do something different or communicate to your partner that you want to try something different, or that it doesn't feel like it's not, just, you know, a simple phrase like, do you know what, this isn't really working for me at the moment, or I used to really enjoy this and it's not working for me as much anymore. Can we try something different? Because we can get then so stuck in that way of being, but also it's, you know, sex is something that is pleasure focused and fun and to be enjoyed, and is not a performance.
And along those lines, how do you keep the spark in a long-term relationship when it comes to your sex life?
You have to do it with intention. You have to try. And I think the way that our brains work is we habituate, we get used to things. And so of course we're going to get used to having sex with the same person. We're going to learn their body. We're going to learn what we like, what they like. It might become might become more predictable. We are busy. You know, if you think about the start of relationships, we kind of almost forget everything else that's happening around us. We throw everything into getting to know this new person, and sex is a part of that for most people. And so we kind of forget to call our friends. We might drop the ball at work a bit. We're like throwing everything into this, and then we have to kind of come back to reality a bit more and get into the rhythm of life. And so I think that what we see consistently in couples research is the couples that make an effort with their sex lives are the ones that are reporting the most sexual satisfaction. And again, it's not the sexy, exciting answer, but it's the true one. Yeah. Which is that if we kind of sit back and wait for it to change, it's not going to.
Yeah. So actually taking an active role in maintaining and restarting that spark.
Definitely. And there's so many ways that we can change that routine. We can talk about changing routine, like changing something every time we have sex, doing one thing differently, whether it's lights on, lights off, starting with our clothes on, clothes off, with music on, using a lubricant, introducing a sex toy, trying a different position, having sex in a different room of the house, where, you know, there are so many kind of micro ways that we can be constantly changing things, which can make a difference.
That's so funny. My friend who brought up that conversation the other day at dinner has just replied to my question story, saying, oh my god, lol, can you ask about difficulty finishing from sex when it comes to a man in a gay relationship?
I mean, we can talk about it with men just in general. So it's not an uncommon thing. What we talk about is kind of delayed ejaculation. And again, it's quite similar to the mindfulness stuff we were talking about earlier, is if we become so focused on it, we get preoccupied with the thought of, I've got to finish, I've got to reach orgasm, I've got to get there, I've got to come. That becomes, in a way, overriding of us focusing on the physical pleasure that's actually going to get us there. And with sex, because we feel like there's still this taboo, because there's this discomfort around it, even if it happens maybe once or twice, we get so in our heads then that the next time we go into sex, we're already thinking, oh, that thing's going to happen again. What am I going to do if that happens again? You know, we're building up that anxiety before we've even got there, and it's such a quick cycle to start.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And I can imagine as well in relationships, especially that aren't heterosexual, where I assume in the part, like for however many years of your life where you're told one thing is quote unquote wrong or not normal, or something that you literally have to come out about, which, you know, even the concept of that being like you have to reveal your sexual kind of orientation, which seems kind of crazy. I can imagine as well, you know, not even like conscious shame or like any of those things in terms of perpetuating while you're having sex.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the best things to do is to just say to a partner, do you know what, I'm really struggling to orgasm a bit at the moment, so don't think that if I don't, that I'm not enjoying myself. But it might not happen. It's nothing, you know, it's not a big drama. And we're still gonna have sex and I'm still gonna enjoy it. like if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
But I can still enjoy sex without it. And just even the act of taking the pressure off means that we don't have to then be focusing on, and that's when it becomes performative. Sex can become performative rather than pleasurable.
Mid-20s, been married less than a year. Is it normal to barely want to have sex at all?
I think that it's, for me, I'm interested in the change. If there was like if there was a big change for someone, what we see is that also a lot of women don't experience a lot of spontaneous desire. And again, then we feel that the problem is with us because that's the version that we see everywhere all the time, or the version that we're told we should feel. And I think that is about learning how to define desire for you. There's some absolutely brilliant TED Talks. There's an amazing book called Mind the Gap. But educating yourself on how desire works for you, because suddenly you realize, okay, it's not me, it's how I was taught about this, and we can reshape those ideas, and suddenly you can start to be in control of it. And I think that that's a big part of it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. This one's really interesting. Why is going down on girls so much more stigmatized than with men?
I have no idea.
Would love to know.
Yeah, do you know what? I think that there's a lot of shame, particularly around female genitals or vulvas, and it's been quite historical. I mean, there are certain cultures and histories where the vulva was celebrated, and then if you think about even when you're kind of at school and you're learning about periods and things, what those teenage narratives were like, oh, disgusting, periods are disgusting. Like, how many of us grew up with that kind of messaging? And I think that there is, and we see that because we see that the kind of feminine hygiene industry has really tried to hook in insecurities. You know, that there are now like supplements to make your vulva and your vagina smell better and things like that, which are not necessary. So the vagina is pH balanced and does not need interrupting. Please do not interrupt with it, because then you can have repeated yeast infections and things like that. But I think that so much of it has been because female sexuality, sexual pleasure, sexual bodies have always been seconded.
And perhaps, and this is based on entirely no evidence, but just my thoughts, perhaps as well the emasculation of kind of service to a woman, like in that way where, we see, especially probably in things like porn, where like a blowjob is seen as like serving your partner in that way. And we already as a society have issues when it comes to, maybe a man serving a woman. And so that kind of association of the flipping of, I guess, power dynamics, even though it's not a power dynamic, it's a sexual act. But I can imagine that probably
plays a role.
Yeah, plays a role.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And we know that female health, research is behind that of men's. We see a real kind of lacking. And actually, the sex toy industry is one where female pleasure has almost become much bigger. There are much more sex toys for women than there are for men, and it's an enormous, enormous market. And I think that's one of the ones where we've seen this kind of flipping of that dynamic, where actually that is the priority.
Yeah, well, wherever there's a kind of gap in terms of being underserved, there's obviously a huge
market
opportunity as well. Do you think that the porn your partner watches says something deeper about them in terms of their kind of desire?
No, not necessarily, because a lot of people watch pornography that doesn't relate to what they want to do in life. They're just engaging with fantasy and curiosity, in quite a safe way a lot of the time. If they're we see that, I think, the ethical pornographers currently, so people like Erica Lust, who I was talking about earlier, so she has something called X Confessions, where people send in their confessions and they're making them into porn films.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, particularly because that was what people kind of wanted to see and are interested in. But no, I think obviously for some people it might show like an interest for something that they want to go and try further, but for a lot of people, how they engage with their sexual fantasies is a lot of the time, particularly if they're doing that in their imagination as well, is a way of engaging with it without having to explore it in real life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've not actually thought of it in that way, because I know that there's like, especially when non-heterosexual relationships, the way that kind of porn opens up that experience to being able to kind of experience that, obviously, you're saying it's a way of experiencing it without actually experiencing it, and might just be out of kind of curiosity or interest, or, you know, being able to engage in a way without it being something that you kind of do as a...
Well, we know that a lot of women that identify as straight watch female pornography, so porn without male bodies in, or...
And why is that?
Out of curiosity, out of interest, because they find that it turns them on, but it's not what they want to do in real life. So something can be sexually exciting, but not your sexuality and preference.
And do you think it could also be, I think a lot of porn is obviously aimed towards male pleasure, and obviously two or more women is, without a male there, is kind of going to be, you know, aimed towards female pleasure in that way.
I think that's what's exciting about seeing the kind of new wave of pornography that's being made at the moment, and feminist pornography, because it's being designed, I think, a lot of the time with users in mind, and not necessarily kind of clickbait titles and things like that. Right. And I think that can be something that's, you know, a lot of it's also paid porn, and so there's the ethical side of it, which is that there are levels of protection in there which are designed to create a safer space for everybody involved.
Yeah. Oh, well, this has been so incredibly interesting. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise. I have no doubt that lots of people are going to learn a lot from this episode, and also just to enjoy, you know, your work in terms of the kind of opening up the space and destigmatizing and just talking, which, I mean, you'll know obviously how important that is. But yeah, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.